Imagine standing at the edge of the impossible, facing a mountain too tall, a storm too fierce, a dream too distant. What if I told you that you don't need to move that mountain on your own? What if the key to breaking through the impossible was already in your hands? Stay with me, because what you're about to hear could change everything. Have you ever stood before something that seemed utterly impossible? Maybe it's a mountain you can't seem to climb, a door that just won't open, or a dream that feels too far away. We all face moments in life when the odds are stacked against us, when the path ahead seems completely blocked. And in those moments, we wonder, what if this is it? What if I'm never going to overcome this? What if there's just no way forward? But here's the truth, the story doesn't end there. In fact, that is exactly where God's power begins. When we face the impossible, it's easy to think it's the end of the road. We become so focused on the walls, the obstacles, the challenges, that we forget there's something much greater at work, a power that is beyond anything we can see or understand. This power isn't bound by the limits of the natural world. It doesn't obey the rules we've set for ourselves. This power is from God, and it has the ability to transform the impossible into something absolutely miraculous. Think about the moments in the Bible where God made the impossible possible. Take, for example, the Israelites trapped between the Red Sea and the pursuing Egyptian army. It seemed like certain death. There was no way out, but God did the impossible. He parted the sea, and the Israelites walked through on dry ground. No one saw that coming, but it was in that moment when all hope seemed lost that God moved in a way that no one could have ever imagined. Or consider the story of David and Goliath. David, a young shepherd with nothing but a sling, standing before a giant warrior who had terrified an entire army. It was a fight that made no sense. Yet with faith in God, David defeated Goliath not by his own strength, but by the power of God working through him. It wasn't just a victory, it was a supernatural intervention, a demonstration of what happens when we believe that God can turn the impossible into reality. And don't forget about the miracles Jesus performed. Time and again, he healed the sick, cast out demons, and even raised the dead. Each time it was a reminder that with God, all things are possible. One of my favorite moments is when Jesus said, "With man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible." Those words are more than just a promise. They are a declaration of the power that is available to you and me. Now, you might be thinking that was then, but what about now? What about today? What about my life? The truth is, God hasn't changed. His power is just as real today as it was in those ancient times. The impossible still stands before us, but that's where God's greatness shines the brightest. The walls that seem unbreakable, He can tear them down. Doors that won't open, He can unlock them. The dreams that seem out of reach, He can bring them into reality. But here's the catch. We have to believe. We have to believe that God can do what seems impossible. We have to trust that His power is greater than our circumstances, our doubts, and our fears. Faith is the key that unlocks God's miraculous power. It's not enough to just wish for a breakthrough. We need to actively believe that God will move in ways that will blow our minds. Faith doesn't always mean seeing the whole picture right away. It means stepping forward even when you can't see the end of the road. It means trusting that God knows what He's doing even when we don't. Remember, when God told Abraham that he would become the father of many nations, it didn't make sense. He was old and his wife Sarah was barren. But God doesn't work by our logic. He works by His will, His plan, and His timing. And Abraham believed that belief made all the difference. The question today isn't, can God do the impossible? The real question is, do you believe He can do it for you? Maybe you're facing something that seems insurmountable. A financial crisis, a health issue, a broken relationship. Maybe you feel like you've tried everything and nothing is working. But let me tell you this, God specializes in the impossible. What seems like the end of the road to you might be the beginning of something incredible in God's plan. What if this is the moment when you stop seeing the obstacle and start seeing the opportunity for God to move in ways you never thought possible? What if you could believe that God will make a way when there seems to be no way? The impossible is not something to fear. It's a canvas for God's greatness. And with God, nothing is beyond reach. So today I invite you to take that step of faith. Believe that God can do what you can't. Believe that He can move mountains, part seas, and open doors that no one thought could be opened. Believe that the impossible is just the beginning of a miracle. Are you ready to believe? To see the impossible become possible in your life, the journey of faith begins with one step. Let's take it together. There are moments in life when we find ourselves standing before what feels like an insurmountable wall. It's a moment when everything around us says no, when every circumstance tells us that there's no way forward. It's easy to feel hopeless in those times. We look at our situation and the temptation is to give up, to accept that there's no way out. But here's the truth, this is where the miracle begins. This is where we begin to see what God can truly do when we trust Him with the impossible. You see, God doesn't work the way we expect. We have a tendency to think in terms of what's logical, what makes sense. If we're facing something difficult, we want to know the steps, the process, how it can be fixed. But God operates on a completely different level. When we face what seems impossible, it's not the end, it's the beginning of God's opportunity to reveal His power. Just think about some of the most remarkable stories in the Bible. Take, for instance, the story of the Israelites trapped between the Red Sea and the Egyptian army. It was a dire situation. Behind them was an army intent on capturing them, and ahead of them was a vast, impassable sea. It seemed like there was no way out, no hope left. But what happened? God parted the Red Sea, and the Israelites walked through on dry ground. What had seemed like an inescapable situation was turned into a miraculous deliverance. This wasn't just a coincidence or good luck. This was the power of God breaking through the natural laws and doing something that no human mind could have imagined. Now think about David, a young shepherd boy facing the giant Goliath. The entire army of Israel was paralyzed by fear, and everyone knew that Goliath was an unbeatable force. But David had something that no one else did: faith. He believed that God could deliver him, even though everything pointed to defeat. With a simple sling and a stone, David defeated Goliath. It wasn't his own strength or ability, it was the power of God working through him. God made the impossible possible. In the New Testament, Jesus demonstrated this same principle time and time again. Remember when He fed the 5,000 with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish? A crowd of thousands, and the disciples were certain there was no way they could feed everyone. But Jesus took the little they had and multiplied it, turning scarcity into abundance. It didn't make sense. It wasn't possible by human standards. But with Jesus, nothing is impossible. These stories aren't just historical accounts. They're powerful reminders that God is still in the business of doing the impossible. And He hasn't changed. The same God who parted the sea, who helped David defeat Goliath, who fed thousands with a tiny meal, He is the same God who can work in your life today. Whatever you are facing, however impossible it may seem, God is more than able to do what you can't. It all starts with faith. Faith is the key that unlocks God's miraculous power. You see, faith isn't just about believing that God can, it's about believing that God will. When we step forward in faith, trusting that God is going to act on our behalf, that's when we begin to see His hand move in ways we never expected. Faith is the willingness to believe in what we cannot see and trust that God's plan is greater than anything we can understand. It's not about waiting for everything to line up perfectly. It's about stepping out in trust even when the road ahead seems unclear. The challenges we face are often a reflection of how much we rely on ourselves rather than on God. When we think we can fix everything on our own, we limit what God can do. But when we come to the end of our own strength, when we face an impossible situation and know that we can't do it on our own, that's when we give God room to work. That's when He takes over and shows us that He's more than capable of handling what we thought was impossible. Think about it. If we only relied on what was possible in our own strength, we would never experience the greatness of God's power. It's in those moments of impossibility that we see God's faithfulness and His ability to do what no one else can. And the beauty of it is that God's miracles aren't just for the past, they're for today, for you, for me. Whatever you are facing right now, no matter how impossible it seems, God is ready and willing to move on your behalf. The Bible says that with God all things are possible. And that promise isn't just for the heroes of the faith we read about, it's for you, right where you are. When you believe that God can do the impossible, you open the door for His miracles to flow into your life. It doesn't matter how big the mountain is in front of you or how deep the valley feels. With God, you have everything you need to overcome. So today I want to encourage you, don't let what seems impossible hold you back. Don't let the obstacles in your life define you. Let them be the very opportunity for God to show up and do what only He can do. Believe that the impossible is just the beginning of your breakthrough. With God, there's no limit to what He can accomplish in your life. All you need is faith and the willingness to trust that with Him, the impossible can become possible. There are moments in life when we feel like we've come to the end of the road. We look at our situation and it seems like there's no way out. The obstacles in front of us seem insurmountable. The dreams we've been chasing feel more like distant illusions. It's easy to let doubt creep in and tell ourselves that this is where the journey ends. But what if I told you that this very moment, the one where you feel stuck, the one where you feel like nothing is working, could be the turning point where God does something miraculous in your life? The truth is, God doesn't work by the world's timeline. He doesn't need our plans to succeed or our understanding to make things happen. His timing is not our timing. And that's a difficult pill to swallow sometimes, especially when we're facing the impossible. We want things to happen on our terms according to our schedule. We want the breakthrough to come immediately, to see the solution right away. But God's ways are higher than ours, and His timing is always perfect, even when we don't see it. Think back to the story of Abraham. God promised him that he would be the father of many nations. But Abraham was old and his wife Sarah was barren. In their eyes, that promise seemed impossible. How could they have children when they were past the age of having kids? But God had a plan, and His timing was perfect. Years passed, and they waited, and waited, and waited. There were moments when doubt must have crept in, moments when Abraham and Sarah must have wondered if they had misunderstood God's promise. But God didn't forget. At the exact right moment, He gave them Isaac, and through Isaac the promise was fulfilled. What seemed impossible in their eyes was nothing for God, but they had to wait, and in that waiting, their faith was strengthened. Sometimes the waiting is the hardest part. We get tired of waiting. We start to question whether God really heard our prayers, whether the breakthrough is ever going to come. But what if the waiting is exactly what's preparing us for the miracle? What if God is working behind the scenes, doing things we can't see, shaping us into the people we need to be in order to handle the miracle when it arrives? There's something powerful about trusting in God's timing. It forces us to let go of control and rely on His plan, even when we can't see it. When we're in the midst of waiting for the impossible, we have two choices. We can give in to frustration and doubt, or we can choose to trust that God's timing is perfect. When we choose trust, we open ourselves up to the possibility of God's incredible work in our lives. Take a moment and think about the people in your life who faced the impossible and seen it turn around. Maybe it was a financial crisis that seemed like it would never end. Maybe it was a health issue that dragged on for years. Or maybe it was a relationship that seemed beyond repair. Now think about how many of those stories came with a season of waiting. In that season, when things seemed hopeless, God was preparing something far greater than what they could have imagined. The miracle didn't come right away, but when it did, it was more than worth the wait. God's timing often doesn't align with our expectations. We want things to happen quickly, and we want them to happen in a way that makes sense to us. But God sees the bigger picture. He knows exactly when the right moment is for the breakthrough to come. And often that right moment is not just about us receiving something. It's about our faith growing, our hearts being prepared, and our trust in Him deepening. Think about the story of Lazarus. When Jesus heard that his friend Lazarus was sick, He didn't rush to him. In fact, He stayed where he was for 2 more days before going to him. By the time Jesus arrived, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. Everyone around him was questioning why he hadn't come sooner. They wondered why he had let Lazarus die. But Jesus knew something they didn't. His timing wasn't about avoiding pain, it was about revealing His glory in a way they could never have expected. When Jesus called Lazarus out of the tomb, it wasn't just a resurrection, it was a demonstration of God's power over death itself. In the same way, when you're facing the impossible, God's timing isn't about avoiding the struggle, it's about showing you His power in a way that will leave you in awe. You may not understand why things are taking longer than you expected, but trust that God is preparing you for something far greater than what you could ever have imagined. The waiting, the struggle, the frustration, it's all part of God's divine plan. The impossible is only impossible in our eyes, but in God's hands, it's an opportunity for a miracle. And in His perfect timing, He will reveal that miracle in a way that will leave no doubt that it was His work and His timing that made it all possible. So don't give up. Trust the process, trust the waiting, and trust the God who makes all things possible, even when it feels like time is running out. Your miracle is coming, and it's going to be more incredible than you can imagine. When we look at our lives, we often find ourselves facing obstacles that seem impossible to overcome. Maybe it's a financial crisis that drains you at every turn, or a relationship that's falling apart despite all your efforts. Perhaps it's a health issue, a career setback, or a dream that feels so distant that you wonder if it was ever meant to come true. In moments like these, it can feel as though there's no way forward, and that the path ahead is too dark to see any light. But here's something incredibly powerful. Even in those moments of desperation, when all you can see is darkness and struggle, God is at work. The Bible is filled with examples of people facing what seemed like impossible situations. And in each case, God did something extraordinary. Take, for example, the story of Moses. When God called him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, Moses was filled with doubts. He was facing a Pharaoh who had the power of an entire empire behind him, and the Israelites were enslaved and broken. How could Moses, a simple man, stand up to that? How could he possibly lead a people to freedom when the odds were so overwhelmingly stacked against him? But God didn't ask Moses to rely on his own strength. He didn't need Moses to have all the answers. He just needed Moses to trust Him. And through Moses' obedience, God performed one of the greatest miracles in history, the parting of the Red Sea and the Israelites walking through on dry land, escaping the Egyptian army that had once held them captive. What seemed impossible became reality not because of Moses, but because of the power of God working through him. In your life, the impossible may not look like parting an ocean, but that doesn't mean it's any less real. The problems you're facing may seem like a sea of obstacles with no way across, but that's exactly where God can show His power. What's important to remember is that the impossible is never too much for God. The situations that feel beyond repair, the problems that seem too big to solve, the pain that feels too deep to heal, those are all opportunities for God to demonstrate His power in ways you can't even imagine. Think about the story of the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years. She had spent all her money on doctors, but no one could help her. She was an outcast, a woman rejected by society because of her condition. She was living in what seemed like an impossible situation with no way out. But then she heard about Jesus. She heard about the man who had been healing the sick, raising the dead, and performing miracles. And in that moment, something in her heart stirred. She believed that if she could just touch the hem of His garment, she would be healed. She knew it was impossible for her to just walk up and speak to Him. She couldn't do it in the usual way, but she believed that with a simple touch, God could do the impossible. And when she reached out, that act of faith changed everything. Jesus turned and said, "Daughter, your faith has healed you." What seemed like an impossible, hopeless situation was transformed in an instant. She wasn't healed because of what she could do. She was healed because of her faith in God's power to do the impossible. Now you may be thinking, that sounds incredible, but how does this apply to me? You might not be facing a physical illness like the woman, but we all have our own impossible situations. Maybe it's a relationship that's hanging by a thread, and no matter how hard you try, it feels like it's beyond repair. Maybe it's your job situation, and you're wondering how you'll make ends meet. Maybe you're dealing with doubts and fears that seem to paralyze you every day. Whatever your impossible situation is, remember this: you are not alone. God sees you in your struggle and He's ready to step into your situation and turn things around. God doesn't ask you to have all the answers. He doesn't ask you to figure out the way forward on your own. He asks you to trust Him. Trust that He is bigger than your problems. Trust that His power can break through any obstacle. Trust that with God, the impossible becomes possible. Faith isn't about seeing the solution right away. It's about believing that even when you don't see the way out, God is already working on your behalf. He's already moving behind the scenes, making a way where there seems to be no way. When we trust God with our impossible, we open the door for Him to do what only He can do. It's easy to get caught up in the how of the situation, to focus on the logistics and the practicalities. But God isn't limited by the same things we are. He doesn't need everything to fit Him. What He needs is our willingness to step out in faith and trust that He will provide. He promises that He is faithful, that He will never leave us or forsake us, and that His plans for us are always for our good. When you trust God with your impossible situation, you allow Him to show up in a way that will leave you in awe of His power. So the next time you feel like you're facing an impossible challenge, remember it's not the end. It's the beginning of something greater. The impossible is just the place where God's miracles happen. What seems like a roadblock is often the very space where God will show His glory. So don't be afraid. Trust Him. With God, nothing is impossible. And when He shows up, He'll do more than you could have ever imagined. Sometimes life feels like a constant battle. You push forward, but every step feels heavier than the last. The weight of your problems, the struggle of your journey, it all seems like it's too much to handle. The world tells you that if you're facing difficulties, it's a sign of failure. It whispers that you should just give up, because surely if things were meant to work out, they would have already. But here's the secret they won't tell you. It's in the struggle that God is doing His most profound work. Think about the stories of the great heroes in the Bible. None of them were immune to difficulty or hardship. They all faced challenges that, at the time, seemed insurmountable. But what made them stand out wasn't their ability to avoid problems, it was their perseverance in the face of them. They learned to keep moving even when it didn't make sense, and they kept their eyes on the promise of what lay ahead. It was in the struggle, in the moments when they felt most alone, that God's plan was unfolding. Take Joseph, for example. He was the youngest of his brothers, and when his father gave him a coat of many colors, it filled his brothers with jealousy and hatred. They sold him into slavery, and he was taken to Egypt, far away from his family, his home, and everything he knew. Joseph's life seemed to go from bad to worse. He worked in Potiphar's house, only to be falsely accused of something he didn't do and thrown into prison. If anyone had a reason to give up, to throw in the towel, it was Joseph. But what did he do? He kept going. He didn't let his circumstances define him. Even in the darkness of prison, Joseph trusted that God had a plan for him. And in the end, he rose to the second highest position in Egypt, saving his family and an entire nation from famine. His journey wasn't easy, but through the pain and the struggle, God was shaping him for something greater. Or consider the Apostle Paul. His ministry was marked by hardship, beatings, imprisonments, shipwrecks, constant threats to his life. He was rejected, betrayed, and misunderstood, yet he never stopped moving forward. Paul knew that the journey of faith was not a smooth ride, but a path filled with challenges. And despite it all, he wrote in his letters that it was in his weakness that God's strength was most evident. His struggle wasn't a sign of God's absence. It was a sign of God's presence. God was with him every step of the way, even when it seemed like all hope was lost. Paul didn't let his trial stop him. Instead, he trusted that God was using each one to refine him, to strengthen his faith, and to advance his kingdom. Your struggles may not look like Joseph's or Paul's, but that doesn't mean they're any less significant. Maybe you're facing a financial crisis that seems like it will never end. Maybe your marriage is on the brink of falling apart, and you don't know if it can be saved. Maybe you've been working tirelessly toward a dream, but no matter how hard you try, it feels like you're getting nowhere. In those moments, it's easy to believe the lie that God has forgotten you or that He doesn't care. But the truth is, God is working even when you can't see it. Every step you take in faith, no matter how small, is a step forward in God's plan for you. The struggle you're in right now is not the end of your story, it's a part of the process. And God uses the process to prepare you for the promise. When you're facing difficulty, it's crucial to remember that God is never wasting your pain. Every challenge you face is an opportunity for growth, for transformation, and for God's glory to be revealed. It's easy to want to give up when things get tough, but that's when God is doing the most work in your life. When everything seems impossible, He's preparing you for something greater. It's in the valley that your roots go deep, and it's in the struggle that your faith grows stronger. The beauty of faith is that it's not about avoiding difficulty, it's about knowing that God is with you in the midst of it. It's trusting that even when you can't see the way forward, He's already there paving the way. The same God who parted the Red Sea, who healed the sick, who raised the dead, He's with you, walking beside you through your struggles. And just like Joseph and Paul, He's working all things together for your good. The battles you're fighting right now aren't in vain. They're the very thing that will lead to your breakthrough, to your victory, to your testimony. So when you feel like giving up, when the weight of the world is too heavy, remember that your struggle is not a sign of failure, it's a sign that God is working. Trust that He is faithful, that He is present, and that He is using every moment of your journey to bring you closer to the person He created you to be. The struggle might not be easy, but it will always be worth it. Keep going, keep trusting, and know that with God, your victory is already secured. There comes a time in everyone's life when they face a decision that could change everything. You're standing at a crossroads, unsure of what path to take. You know that one choice could lead to success, fulfillment, and the life you've always dreamed of, while the other might lead to disappointment, failure, or regret. In moments like these, it's easy to be paralyzed by fear. We overthink, we hesitate. We ask ourselves, what if I make the wrong choice? What if I fail? But what if, instead of being afraid of the decision, we took a step forward in faith, trusting that God would guide us through whatever comes next? In the Bible, one of the most powerful stories of faith and decision-making comes from the story of Abraham. God called him to leave everything he knew, the comfort of his home, the security of his family, and the land where he had lived for years. God promised Abraham that He would make him the father of many nations. But there was one problem. Abraham and his wife Sarah had no children, and they were both too old to have any. Everything in the natural world told them that this promise was impossible. But Abraham trusted God. He made the decision to step out in faith, not knowing exactly how it would all unfold, but trusting that God's plan was better than his own. And in the end, through Abraham's obedience, God made aware there seemed to be no way. What seemed impossible became possible, and Abraham became the father of many nations, just as God had promised. This is what faith looks like in action. It's not about having all the answers or understanding how everything will work out. It's about trusting that God knows what's best for us, even when it doesn't make sense in the moment. Abraham didn't know how the promise would be fulfilled. He didn't know how God would make it happen. All he knew was that God had called him, and he chose to obey, even in the face of uncertainty. And through his faith, he became a part of something much bigger than himself. In your own life, you might be standing at a similar crossroads. You might be facing a decision about your career, your relationships, your health, or your future. And just like Abraham, you don't know how it will all turn out. You're unsure of the outcome, and that uncertainty can be paralyzing. But here's the thing, God isn't asking you to have it all figured out. He's asking you to trust Him. He's asking you to take that first step of faith, knowing that He will guide you and lead you to where He wants you to go. The Bible tells us that God's plans for us are good. They're plans to give us a future and a hope, even when we can't see the end result. Trusting God doesn't mean that everything will be easy or that the road ahead will be smooth. It means that we trust that God's hand is in every moment, that He is with us through every decision, and that He is faithful to lead us. We don't need to fear the unknown because God already knows what lies ahead. And He promises that He will never leave us or forsake us no matter what. Take a moment and think about the times in your life when you faced a difficult decision. Maybe you've had to leave behind something familiar like Abraham did. Maybe you've had to trust God when it felt like there was no way forward. And when you look back, you can see how God's hand was guiding you, even when you didn't understand the bigger picture. Those moments of uncertainty when you stepped out in faith are often the times when God does His most incredible work in our lives. So when you're faced with a big decision, don't let fear hold you back. Don't let doubt and uncertainty paralyze you. Instead, choose to trust God. Take that first step in faith, knowing that God is leading you. And when you step out, you might be amazed at what He will do. Just like with Abraham, God has a plan for your life that is bigger than you can imagine. Your faith, even in the smallest decisions, can have a ripple effect, changing not just your life, but the lives of those around you. God's plan for you is bigger than your fears, bigger than your doubts, and bigger than any challenge you'll face along the way. Trusting God with your decisions is an act of faith. It's saying, I don't have all the answers, but I know the one who does. And when you make that decision to trust Him, you open the door to a future filled with possibilities. You may not know exactly what's ahead, but you can be sure of one thing: God is with you, and He will lead you to where you need to be. So take that step, no matter how uncertain the path may seem. Trust that God will provide the direction, and trust that His plan is greater than anything you could have imagined for yourself. You won't regret it. We all have dreams. Some are small, like making it through a tough day, while others are big, so big that they feel almost impossible to achieve. We dream of breakthroughs in our careers, healing in our bodies, restoration in our relationships, and a sense of purpose that drives us every day. But for many of us, there's a big gap between where we are now and where we want to be. That gap can feel like an overwhelming chasm, and the road to getting from here to there can seem so long, so difficult, that it's easy to wonder if we'll ever make it. When we're faced with that gap, the temptation is to give up, to think that maybe those dreams were never meant to come true, or that we've just been waiting too long. But what if I told you that sometimes waiting is exactly what you need? In the Bible, there's a powerful story of waiting that many of us can relate to: the story of David. David was a young shepherd boy when God chose him to be the future king of Israel. God saw something in David that no one else saw. But even though God had anointed David, even though he had been promised a great future, the road to that future was long and filled with challenges. David didn't become king right away. Instead, he spent years waiting, and during that time, he faced rejection, betrayal, and even the constant threat of death. The current king, Saul, was jealous of David's rise and sought to kill him. David was forced to live as a fugitive, running from place to place, hiding from Saul's soldiers. But in the midst of this waiting period, God wasn't absent. In fact, it was during these years of waiting that God was doing His deepest work in David's life. David wasn't just waiting around for the crown to be handed to him. He was growing. He was learning. He was becoming the man who could rule a nation. Those years of hardship, the betrayal by people he loved, the long days in hiding, they all shaped David into the leader he would eventually become. And when David was finally crowned king, he was more than ready for the responsibility that came with it. He wasn't the same young shepherd boy he had been when God first called him. His time of waiting had prepared him for something greater. God used those years to mold him, to teach him trust, patience, resilience, and humility. Now, you might be thinking, that sounds great for David, but what about me? You might feel like you've been waiting for something, a breakthrough, an opportunity, a moment when everything changes. It's easy to look at others and think they've had it easier, or that their dreams are coming true while yours remain out of reach. But here's the truth: your waiting is not in vain. Just like David, you are not stuck in limbo. Even in the waiting, God is at work. You may not see it right now, but every moment of waiting is an opportunity for God to prepare you for what's ahead. The dreams you have aren't being delayed, they're being refined. The timing may not be what you expected, but God's timing is always perfect. Sometimes we think that waiting is a sign that God has forgotten us, that our prayers are unanswered, or that we're being punished. But waiting is not a sign of abandonment. In fact, it's often a sign of God's care. Just as a gardener waits for the right season to plant, and a builder waits for the perfect moment to lay a foundation, God knows that the right moment for your dreams to bloom has not yet arrived. It's not that He's forgotten you or that He's not listening. It's that He is preparing you for the success that's coming. He's preparing your heart, your mind, and your circumstances to handle the blessing He's about to give you. He's taking the time to make sure you're ready for everything that's ahead. Look at the example of Joseph as well. Joseph's journey to greatness was one of incredible waiting. Sold into slavery by his brothers, thrown into prison for something he didn't do. It seemed like Joseph was just stuck in a cycle of waiting with no hope for change. But even in the darkest moments, God was with him. And eventually Joseph was elevated to second in command over all of Egypt, a position from which he could save his family and an entire nation from famine. What looked like years of wasted waiting turned out to be the perfect training ground for the leader Joseph needed to become. Waiting doesn't mean doing nothing. It doesn't mean standing still and hoping for something to fall into your lap. It means using the time to prepare yourself for what's next. God is using your waiting to strengthen your faith, deepen your character, and equip you with everything you need for your future. It's easy to get discouraged when the dream feels too far away, but remember this, your waiting is a part of the process. The best things in life often take time, and the things that are worth having require patience. If you feel like you're waiting on something, whether it's a breakthrough in your career, a healing in your body, or a restored relationship, trust that God is working even in the waiting. You might not see the results today, but trust that every moment you spend waiting is a moment that is preparing you for something greater. Don't lose heart. Just as God was faithful to David, to Joseph, and to countless others, He is faithful to you. Your waiting is not wasted. It's part of the plan, and the promise is still coming. So keep trusting, keep waiting, and know that when the time is right, God will make everything beautiful in His time.
Beneath the stars we whisper dreams. A violin plays soft, it seems. The night unfolds its velvet wings. We dance on air like fancy things. A crescendo builds with every beat. Our hearts, they dance in perfect heat. The world is ours in silent screams. We're floating high on whispering dreams. Together we are one sweet song. The night won't be too late, too long. Our melody will carry on in every note where we belong. The orchestra, it swells to life. The strings, they cut the dark like a knife. Your voice an echo in my soul. In every verse we find the goal. Oh, violins, they cry so pure. In every touch we find the cure. Your hand in mine, the music flows. In whispered dreams, the magic grows. Together we are one sweet song. The